Hey, last time we were talking about atomic weapons. I told you that there were several sites around the world where we have, I say we human beings, archaeologists primarily, have discovered sites where nuclear weapons have been exploded. Now, if you were traveling around in the Soviet Union or the former Soviet Union, you'd find places where they have detonated nuclear devices. And where they detonate those nuclear devices above ground, the heat is so intense that it melts the sand and turns it to glass. Now, we know in modern times that the first atomic bomb exploded was in 1945 here in the United States, down a place called Alamogordo, New Mexico. And where that first bomb went off, down on the ground, you'll see the sand fused into glass. And so when we see that, we know from looking at it, wow, there was a nuclear weapon went off here. All right, now, if we were to find those same puddles of glass in other locations in the world, what would we think about that? Well, it would tell you that if you could find the same thing someplace else, somebody else torched off a nuclear weapon. Now, if you found that in Australia, you'd say, well, is it these aborigines that were setting off nuclear weapons? I mean, people that are still eating insects, for crying out loud, running around in loincloths? I don't think that the aborigine people in Australia or the Stone Age people in Borneo or New Guinea have that kind of technology or have had it in the recent past. Especially when we go back in sites and in places where we can be reasonably certain that we can date this for 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago. Now, I want you to notice that the dates in this book don't go back here millions and millions of years. It's going back a few thousand years. Furthermore, in the book, he points out that 3,000 years ago, 5 or 6 civilizations sprout up simultaneously. The Mayas, the Aztecs, the Incas, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, all of these civilizations all appear around 3000 BC. And they've got metallurgy. They've got technology. They've got aluminum. They've got metallurgy. In fact, they've got astronomy. And, when we're talking about astronomy, I'll show you how dumb I am. I look up in the sky and I see stars. Somebody says, can you see the Big Dipper? And I look up there and I say, no. I mean, I don't see anything up there but stars. And somebody says, well, look where I'm pointing. And he points up there. And I say, that's the Big Dipper. And then look over there. See, there's the Little Dipper. You really got to stretch your imagination to put a bunch of stars together and call it Dipper. It's a group of stars, and I guess if you stretch your imagination, you can call that the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper. That's about what I can see. I can't predict when the equinox is going to occur. I've got to go to Hallmark. I've got to go to my calendar over here. I've got to go get the Farmer's Almanac to tell me when the moon's going to come up full. Ancient peoples in China and Babylon and Assyria and so on in Egypt, they were able to do that thousands of years ago. I don't know about people that stick bones through their nose. Can they predict eclipses? I can't predict an eclipse. So the people who can do that today, we call them astronomers, and we say, wow, those people are pretty smart. They need telescopes so that they can look up in the sky. They have to be able to look at the relative positions and the relative times of days and nights, and then observe that, write it down, and then come up to a conclusion that we can predict when the next eclipse is going to occur, an eclipse of the moon or some eclipse of the sun. Well, people could do that thousands of years ago. These are not people running around dragging their knuckles on the ground. And people that can stick 30-ton blocks of rock up in the air and build a place called Stonehenge, those are not savages. Those are very civilized people with an advanced technology, with mathematics. Now, these civilizations have been destroyed. We mentioned this in the last program, that the Egyptians were great, and they were very, very, very sophisticated, had a great civilization, but it was destroyed. What we see in Egypt today is the remnants of a great civilization, which has been overrun by a bunch of Arabs, who are virtually today, we could say, are practically uncivilized barbarians by comparison. Nobody in Egypt today is building any great pyramids. They're not building any of these great ancient cities. They're not raising great monuments and chipping away with hammers and axes and tools and making these hieroglyphic inscriptions like they did thousands of years ago. They're dirt scrabble farmers scratching out a living, doing the best they can. Those are the survivors. And what we find here is great civilizations develop great technologies, and then it's the barbarians that come in and destroy them. Take a look at what's going on in Iraq. The greatest military power in the world is being fought to a standstill by a bunch of sand jockeys that don't even have an airplane, for crying out loud. To my knowledge, the insurgents don't have a single airplane in their Air Force. Every politician in America is saying, we got to get out of there. The great and mighty British Empire took on the Afghanis back in the 19th century. And the Afghanis, these Stone Age savages, for crying out loud, threw the British out of Afghanistan. Well, they didn't exactly throw them out. They just killed enough of them. The British said, well, we've had enough, so we'll leave. Then the Russians came along. Now, the Russians, were a pretty good-sized occupation force back in the 1970s. They thought, well, we'll go into Afghanistan. And we'll teach these Stone Age savages a thing or two. And they brought in helicopters, and they brought in, jet airplanes, and they brought in their military with all of their sophisticated weaponry and tanks and armor and one thing and another. They were there about 10 years, weren't they? About 10 years, and one day they woke up and said, okay, we've had enough. We're getting the hell out of here. Now we got the Americans over there. Got the Americans over there fighting them Afghanis. And I don't think those Afghanis over there have a helicopter, do they? I don't think they've got an airplane. I don't think they've got a helicopter. And the president the other day says, I don't know if it was the president or Condi or somebody went over to Europe and said, hey, you guys ain't, no, it was Gates, the Secretary of Defense. He went over and said, hey, you Europeans ain't putting enough soldiers in the field out there. And those Stone Age barbarians in Afghanistan with bones in their noses are whipping the hell out of us, and we need more troops from Europe. Now, there was a time in the past, when we had great civilizations. Did these great civilizations ever develop atomic weapons? Think about that. Think about the Tower of Babel. Think about your college education. Think about all the books that you've read. And I'm throwing out this thought to you. I've said, do you think it's possible that the Babylonians, the Egyptians, or the Chinese may have had nuclear weapons? And if you're normal, you'd say, Gordon, you've slipped a cog here. You've just dropped off the edge of sanity. All right. Well, let me give you some factors over here, some facts that maybe you've never heard. I never heard this either. But then I live in a very sanitized society. I get my news from Katie Couric, and Katie Couric gets her news from the AP, and the AP gets its information from around the world, we're told, and we're getting the straight skinny, just like the people in Russia got the straight skinny from Izvestia and Pravda. I've showed you over and over again here that our news is managed, our mass media is managed, and we have a political agenda, and we have a fairy tale called evolution. This is a fairy tale for adults that we've all been propagandized with, and we all believe. Now, I'm not telling you what you should believe. I'm just going to give you some facts here. The book is called Dead Men's Secrets by Jonathan Gray. Let's take a look here at the use of radioactivity. Scientists have found a number of uranium deposits that appear to have been mined or depleted anciently. Boys and girls, I've read about this, and you probably heard about it too. Up in Michigan, there's a number of copper mines up there that go back thousands of years. I told you that story from Barry Fells, America, BC. Gloria Farley wrote a book called In Plain Sight. And you can go up there and you can see these old mines. You can see the places where they smelted copper. These are ancient mines and ancient ruins, and they're in Michigan. They're all over the northern United States and southern Canada. They're there. They're not reported by the archaeologists. They shut up about that. They're not over here telling you that there were people over here mining copper. Who was mining the copper, and where were they taking it to? It wasn't the native Indians here. And then, you see, when we get to that part of the story, they shut up. They don't tell you about that. Well, in Egypt, in the tombs of the pharaohs, the pitch used to preserve corpses contained highly radioactive substances. Did you know that? Well, I didn't either. And I'd never heard that, and I'd never read about that. And I can readily understand why. After having watched Katie Couric and Brian Williams and the 6 o'clock news, I can understand why. That does not fit the theory of evolution. Because if you could go in here and show that we've got radioactivity. Now, radioactivity is something that's very, very modern. This Madame Curie, back about 1900 comes along and she discovers a thing called radium and does some experiments on radioactivity. I mean, hell, we're only talking about radioactivity in our modern technology over the last 100 years or so, kids. So, and needless to say, that if we could go back into the tombs of the pyramids, for crying out loud, and find radioactivity, we'd have to say, oh my God, these people must have had a technology that included uranium and radioactivity thousands of years ago. What were they using it for? What did they do with it? You know, if we can start out with radioactivity in 1890 or 1900, and 45 years later we can torch off an atomic bomb, if people had radioactivity at the Tower of Babel in 45 or 50 years, couldn't they develop an atomic bomb? And I'll tell you something else. I'm going to tell you a little story here. You might want to look at this, because we got a report here from God Almighty himself. Every once in a while, the creator of the universe gives us a neat report. He reported this concerning the Tower of Babel. It's recorded here in Genesis chapter 11. The people were building this big tower over here in Iraq. We call it Iraq today. They call it Babylon in the old days.